Every human being on Earth, for the vast majority of our species' existence, had dark hair, black, uniformly, universally, without exception. For roughly 290,000 of the 300,000 years that Homo sapiens has existed, dark hair was the only hair. Not the most common, not the dominant variety, the only one. Every human who lived, every human who died, every human who built a fire, or crossed a river, or watched the stars, or buried their dead for 250,000 years, had dark hair. And then, approximately 10,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia depending on which genetic study you consult, something happened. A mutation, a change in the MC1R gene and related pathways that govern melanin production in hair follicles. A change that reduced eumelanin synthesis and produced, for the first time in the history of the human species, hair that was yellow. Blonde. I need you to hold the strangeness of that timeline, because we treat blonde hair as if it's an ancient feature of human diversity, as if it's been around as long as any other variation in human appearance, as if the blonde child in the schoolyard is expressing something as old as brown eyes or tall stature or the shape of a cheekbone. But it isn't. Blonde hair is new, extraordinarily new. In evolutionary terms, it appeared yesterday. The entire history of blonde hair fits inside the period since the last ice age. It's younger than agriculture, younger than pottery, younger than the domestication of the dog. Younger, possibly, than the oldest surviving buildings on Earth. This raises a simple but critical question. Why did it appear? The official explanation is sexual selection. The theory, proposed by several population geneticists and most famously elaborated by researchers studying ancient European DNA, suggests that blonde hair emerged as a novel trait in a population where partners were scarce and competition for mates was intense. In the harsh, resource-limited environment of Ice Age and post-Ice Age Northern Europe, a rare visible mutation like blonde hair would have attracted disproportionate attention. Novelty was attractive. Attraction led to reproduction. Reproduction spread the gene. Sexual selection drove the trait to high frequency in the population within a few thousand years. And this explanation is elegant. It's plausible. It's consistent with what we know about sexual selection in other species, where novel coloration often spreads through populations via mate preference. The peacock's tail, the mandrill's face, the widowbird's plumage. Evolution is full of examples where being visually different conferred a reproductive advantage. But the deeper I went, the more the sexual selection explanation started to leave questions unanswered that it wasn't designed to address. Because sexual selection explains how a trait spreads once it exists. It doesn't explain why it appeared in the first place. Mutations are random. But the specific mutations that produce blonde hair aren't a single random event. They involve changes in multiple genetic pathways that collectively reduce melanin production in the hair while leaving skin melanin partially intact. The genetic architecture of blonde hair is complex, more complex than a single point mutation, and it appeared based on the genetic evidence in a specific population, in a specific place, during a specific period. Not scattered randomly across the human species, concentrated, localized, as if something in that specific environment triggered or selected for this specific set of genetic changes. The silence was deafening when I started looking at where blonde hair actually originated. Because the popular assumption, the one embedded in cultural imagination across the Western world, is that blonde hair is a Northern European trait. Scandinavian, Germanic, the Vikings. The image is so deeply embedded that blondness has become shorthand for Northern European ancestry in everything from literature to advertising to casual conversation. And the genetic evidence says something more complicated, something that the popular narrative has never fully absorbed. The oldest confirmed genetic evidence of blonde hair doesn't come from Scandinavia. It comes from ancient DNA extracted from human remains in Central Asia and Siberia. The Afanasyevo culture, the Yamnaya horizon, populations that lived on the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea roughly 5,000 years ago, and that carried the genetic variants associated with light hair and light eyes. These populations weren't Scandinavian, they weren't Germanic, they were steppe pastoralists, horse riders, mobile populations that ranged across vast territories from the Urals to the Altai Mountains, and they carried the blonde hair gene before it appeared in Northern Europe. Pull up the ancient DNA studies yourself. The genetic evidence is published, it's peer-reviewed. It tells a story that doesn't match the cultural narrative. Blonde hair didn't originate in the frozen north, it originated on the steppe, and it was carried into Europe by migrating populations that moved westward and northward during the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The steppe populations brought blonde hair to Europe. They brought it to Scandinavia. They brought it to the British Isles. They brought it to the populations that would eventually become the Germanic and Celtic and Slavic peoples that the modern world associates with blondness. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you trace the migration routes. Because the steppe populations didn't just bring blonde hair, they brought a package, a genetic and cultural package that transformed Europe within a few centuries. The ancient DNA evidence shows that the arrival of steppe ancestry in Europe was not a gradual blending, it was a replacement. In many regions, the pre-existing European farming populations were largely replaced by the incoming steppe groups. The genetic contribution of the earlier European inhabitants, the people who had built the megalithic monuments, who had farmed the continent for thousands of years, was dramatically reduced. In some regions, the earlier population's genetic signature virtually disappeared, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the replacement wasn't peaceful. The archaeological record of the period when steppe populations entered Europe shows widespread evidence of violence, settlement destruction, demographic collapse of existing communities, a transformation so rapid and so complete that some archaeologists have described it as one of the largest population turnovers in European prehistory. The deeper I went, the more the appearance of blonde hair in Europe started to look less like a gradual evolutionary event and more like a marker, a genetic signature of a specific population movement that transformed the continent. The blonde hair gene didn't slowly emerge in Northern Europe through tens of thousands of years of adaptation to low sunlight. It arrived, carried by people who came from the East, people who moved fast, who were mobile, who had horses and wheeled vehicles and a social structure organized for expansion. People whose arrival coincided with the dramatic reduction of the populations that had been there before. This raises a question that the popular narrative about blonde hair never asks. What happened to the people who were there before? The pre-steppe Europeans, the farmers, the megalith builders, the people who had inhabited Europe for thousands of years before the steppe migration arrived. Where did they go? The genetic answer is that they were absorbed, reduced to a minority contribution in the gene pool of modern Europeans. Their genetic signature persists, diluted in modern populations. But their demographic dominance was broken within centuries. The steppe populations, carrying blonde hair and light eyes and a specific set of cultural practices, became the dominant ancestry in most of Europe. And the earlier population, dark-haired, with genetic profiles that linked them more closely to modern Southern Europeans and to the earliest farming communities of the Near East, became a substrate rather than a majority. The silence was deafening when I started tracing how this population history was processed by the cultures that emerged from it. Because the mythology of the peoples who descended from the steppe migrations is saturated with references to hair color. The Norse myths describe the gods in terms of their coloring. Thor is red-haired. Sif has golden hair so significant that its loss is a mythological crisis. Balder is described as the most beautiful of the gods, shining, radiant, associated with light itself. The Germanic and Celtic mythological traditions consistently associate light coloring with divinity, with nobility, with a status that darker coloring doesn't carry. And this mythology wasn't just storytelling, it was embedded into social structure. In medieval European societies descended from these populations, light features were consistently associated with noble blood. Darker features were associated with the common people, the peasantry, the lower orders. This wasn't random prejudice. It was, at some deep structural level, a genetic memory. The descendants of the steppe migrants, who carried light hair and who had established themselves as the ruling class across most of Europe, associated their own coloring with their own status. The darker features of the earlier European population, the people who had been displaced or subordinated, were associated with lower status because the people who carried those features had been conquered. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every European culture that descended from the steppe migrations. The association between lightness and nobility, between darkness and commonality, between blonde hair and divine or aristocratic origin. The prejudice wasn't invented arbitrarily. It was encoded into the mythology of peoples who had arrived as conquerors and who needed a narrative that justified their dominance over the populations they had displaced. Here's where the thread connects to something much larger. Because the association between light coloring and social superiority didn't stay in Europe. It was exported through colonialism, through the global expansion of European power that carried European aesthetic preferences, European social hierarchies, and European mythology to every corner of the world. The preference for lighter skin, lighter hair, lighter features that persists in cultures across Asia, Africa, and the Americas isn't a universal human aesthetic. It's a specific cultural export, a product of a specific population history. A 5,000-year-old conquest narrative dressed up as beauty standard and transmitted globally through the machinery of colonialism. The deeper I went, the more the history of blonde hair started to look less like a story about genetics and more like a story about power. About how a visible genetic marker, a trait that appeared in a specific population roughly 10,000 years ago, became associated with that population's expansion, became embedded in that population's mythology, became a signal of status within the social hierarchies that population constructed, and was eventually exported worldwide as a universal standard of beauty. The blonde hair gene didn't just spread through sexual selection. It spread through conquest, through the replacement of earlier populations, through the establishment of social hierarchies in which the conqueror's features became the features of the ruling class, through the construction of mythologies that associated those features with divinity, and through the global export of those mythologies by colonial powers that carried the aesthetic preference to every population they dominated. I'm not telling you that blonde hair is a marker of conquest. I'm telling you the genetic evidence shows that blonde hair entered Europe with migrating steppe populations, whose arrival coincided with the dramatic demographic reduction of the populations already living there. I'm telling you the mythological traditions that emerged from these populations consistently associate light coloring with divine or noble status, and dark coloring with commonality or inferiority. I'm telling you that these associations were exported globally through colonialism and persist today as beauty standards in cultures that have no genetic connection to the original steppe populations. I'm asking why the history of blonde hair is taught as simple genetics when the genetic evidence tells a story about migration, displacement, and the construction of social hierarchies based on visible physical traits. I'm asking why the most globally pervasive beauty standard, the preference for lighter features, maps so precisely onto the expansion routes of a specific ancient population. I'm asking why a mutation that appeared 10,000 years ago in Central Asia became the defining aesthetic preference of a global civilization. I'm asking what it means that the features we were taught to admire carry the genetic signature of a population movement that replaced the people who were there before. I'm asking what beauty standards actually encode, not what they say about aesthetics, what they say about history, about power, about who conquered whom and how the conquerors taught the world to see their own faces as the standard against which all other faces are measured. Handed a beauty standard and told it was nature. What else have we been handed and never thought to question?